I am Mary Curtin, for those of you who have not met me, and I would like to welcome you to the Humphrey School this afternoon for our conversation on perspectives on Afghanistan and US policy. I'm the diplomat in residence and chair of the global policy area here at the Humphrey School. And I'm joined today by two colleagues. First, Professor Dipali Mukhopadhyay is an associate professor in the global policy area at the Humphrey School. She's currently serving as senior expert on Afghanistan for the US Institute of Peace. She's the author of Good Rebel Governance, Revolutionary Politics, and Western Intervention in Syria with Kimberly Howe, and of Warlords, Strongmen, Governors, and the State in Afghanistan. She is deeply knowledgeable about the impact of US policy in Afghanistan, and we are privileged to have her as a colleague. We are also joined by Nasema Zeerak, a Ph.D. student also here at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Her research focuses on the politics of international state building and its impact on conflict-affected countries. Nasema is a native of Afghanistan and brings that combination of her personal perspectives and her research as a PhD student. As many of you know, I've been at the Humphrey School since 2013 after a career at the Department of State as a Foreign Service officer. So I bring my perspectives on the impact on US foreign policy of US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to this discussion. So we are here today for a conversation about Afghanistan and US policy from our three different perspectives. As many have pointed out, the issues we are talking about today did not occur only in July of August of this year. Even though Afghanistan has once again largely fallen off the front pages, the issues are no less critical and indeed no less urgent in terms of the cost both in individual lives and faiths, in the future of Afghanistan, and in the future of US policy. So after each of us provides our thoughts on these issues, we look forward to engaging with you. We invite you to ask questions through the Q&A function and not the chat or raise hand function. The raise hand function has been disabled, and you should put questions into the Q&A box. If you would, please let us know your affiliation when you ask the question, and we'd especially be interested in knowing if you're a student at the Humphrey School. You could put your questions into the Q&A function at any time, and we will try to keep an eye on those as things go along. You can also, if you like, direct your question to one of us or all of us, and we will also sort of make a decision about that. So without further ado, and it looks like we have quite a few people signed on now. So for those of you who just joined, questions should go into the Q&A box and not into the chat, and we have disabled the raise hand function. If you would like to ask a question, the best way to do it is to put it in the Q&A. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask Dipali to go first, and then she will be followed by Nasema. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's really wonderful to be having this conversation with you and with Nasema. We've been looking forward to doing this for a long time, and it's wonderful to see so many of my own students here and so many others. It's very heartening at a time when, as you said, Mary, Afghanistan might not be getting the same media attention that it was a few months ago, but the questions remain as pressing. You know, I think there's a real puzzle at the heart of the last couple of months, which many of us are trying to wrap our heads around, which is how can it be that despite this enormous commitment of resources and time and effort and ideas, that the Afghan government collapsed as quickly as it did after the withdrawal of US forces. And so my attempt to unravel this puzzle is really centers in the fact that the government's fragility, in my point of view, was predestined. It was a part of the post-2001 intervention's DNA. And I think it's a really important time to underscore this argument, because there is this other narrative that has taken hold in Washington, which really is one about an opportunity that was squandered by Afghan leaders and citizens. They were given this chance by the United States to govern democratically, and they didn't take us up on this generous offer. And I think that kind of narrative can lead to a set of assumptions about how we should scale back our own benevolent ambitions, how we shouldn't think about all countries as capable of being governed in democratic terms. And I think that those would be very dangerous conclusions to draw. I think, in fact, the United States invaded Afghanistan to its own ends. And it did so in terms that really crippled any efforts which were ancillary at building capable democratic institutions of government. So for me, it's very important to stress what were the parameters of the intervention that created a set of dependencies and a set of conditionalities and restrictions that really doomed an indigenous political project before it could even begin. When we think about the intervention that way, then I think the end of the war makes a lot of sense as a kind of punctuation mark, but also an exemplification of this American project, which was state building in the service of countering terrorism. And that is a project that at its essence is not about enabling sovereign states to take root or to reassert themselves. It's a project about vengeance, and it's a project in which state building becomes a means toward an end. And the regimes that are created in a project like that are created to be loyal to and dependent on outsiders. And so in that sense, they are designed to ensure rather than overcome weakness. And that's, I think, a very sobering fact that most of us don't really want to internalize when we reflect on what has happened in the last couple of months. You know, we tend to compare in the literature Afghanistan and Iraq to post-Cold War and Cold War era efforts at state building and counterinsurgency. But the age of terror is very different with respect to both ends and means, because it's animated by the notion of the actor that is the terrorist. And so there are these outsiders that enter other countries, and they articulate the parameters of war making and state making as a function of that perceived threat. And so they are controlling that space to their own ends, and they are thrusting the responsibility of managing that threat on insiders. So there's a paradox there, right? That regimes that are birthed as the product of this meta campaign exist in the service of a mission that at once necessitates and constricts their sovereignty. And Afghanistan is the first. I think it's the paradigmatic case, but there are many others that have followed since that we can talk about. And so for me, my work in Afghanistan started actually the summer of 2001, but the first time I traveled there was the summer of 2004, which is when President Karzai came to office through an election. He was anointed at the end of 2001, early 2002. And the regime owed its existence as the internationally recognized government of Afghanistan to this military campaign, right, that the Americans and their allies waged. And in exchange, it was given the opportunity to begin a new chapter of Afghan state formation, which has a long and storied history of its own. But it was to do so in terms that limited its ability to control or influence power, politics, violence across its territory. So there was a kind of exchange that in exchange for recognition, for enormous amounts of aid, that the Afghan state would rent its territory to outsiders who were seeking to avenge the attacks of 9/11 and to eliminate the safe haven for al-Qaeda. And so the result was a kind of precarity, as I will describe, that Karzai and then the successor government, the Ghani government, would confront, which meant they were perennially and deliberately unable to control violence, to control money, to control all sorts of decisions, and that various competitors were thrust upon them who were empowered. My first book was about the warlord commanders who fought with the Americans. The insurgency that we battled for the last 15 years, I don't think was an inevitability. The Taliban was decimated in 2001. But again, the outsiders insisted that the Taliban would be excluded from politics after 2001, even after attempts were made by the decimated previous regime to surrender. And of course, all this time we have seen the use of force through drone warfare and other airstrikes, through the destruction of property, the arbitrary detention of civilians, and so on. And of course, the policies in the region that prevented Iran from playing a constructive role, that enabled Pakistan to provide safe haven. So these are all decisions that are being driven by outside actors, the US and their allies. And they're severely constraining the room for movement for a new government. And that government at the same time, this is the 21st century, so there's an expectation this is a government that will hold elections, that will have a constitution, that will provide rights and privileges to citizens. So there's not a lot of room for maneuver. And, you know, I want to borrow here from a friend of mine, a colleague, the political scientist Noura Lori, who writes about statelessness and people who find themselves without a state. And she argues that governments, her focus is on governments in the Gulf, employ what she calls precarious citizenship to manage migrants and refugees. And she describes this as a kind of legal and bureaucratic invention that relegates people into a permanent status of no status, essentially, and keeps them in that limbo and extracts labor from them and utilizes them for various social and political ends. And I want to argue analogously that I think powerful states deposit weak states into a comparable kind of limbo. And that is what I would call a precarious form of sovereignty, that it helps us understand how did politics in Afghanistan play out the way they did, because both of the regimes that governed in this space of precarious sovereignty did so in terms that were almost entirely oriented around preserving their regimes through forms of palace politics that were not about building sustainable institutions. They were not about delivering effective public goods. They were basically about keeping these regimes alive and able to exert influence in bits and pieces outside of Kabul, on the periphery of the geographical periphery of the country, with whatever means they could, right? So my first book was about the way President Karzai used gubernatorial appointments to pit strong men against each other and use them in the service of governing in the provinces. And I would argue that there were very meaningful forms of governance that emerged as a result, but they certainly didn't look like the kind of good government that the Western donors were seeking. And when President Karzai's successor took office, Ashraf Ghani, people thought, well, maybe this is going to be very different. Ashraf Ghani is a Ph.D. from Columbia in anthropology. He was a senior official at the World Bank, wrote a book called Fixing Failed States, and intellectually had a sort of set of arguments about what sovereign statehood should look like and the possibilities for bureaucratic rule in Afghanistan. And those of us who watched Afghan politics after he came into office in 2014, I think noticed there was a big gap between how he actually governed and this sort of intellectual vision that he had portrayed. He took the helm of what was called the National Unity Government, which was an arrangement that was not incidentally brokered by Secretary Kerry when there was an electoral standoff. And that so-called unity government came to represent such a narrow constituency that when I was in Kabul this summer, just 6 weeks or so before the government fell, that government, which was called the unity government, was known as the Republic of Three, which was a reference to President Ghani and his two closest advisors. And, I think there's a way of understanding, which I'm exploring in a new project, how this second president, who was a member of a diaspora that spent the formative decades of his career in the West, the limits on his ability to draw from the kinds of social political networks and solidarities that President Karzai had drawn, and how he relied increasingly on this very narrow elite, and the policies that he promulgated, the appointments that he made, the war plans increasingly catered to a very particular small regionalized base that really marginalized the larger vanguard of the Republic. So journalists and professors and bureaucrats and soldiers felt excluded, and ultimately they didn't feel represented by or invested in the Afghan state. So there are similarities and there are differences between these two presidents that I'm interested in exploring. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I think the point is that their impulse as leaders at the helm of these precarious regimes was to use the state in the service of their own survival. And they did that by using whatever currencies they had access to, whether that was connections to the diaspora elite or relationships with particular tribes or militant factions. But ultimately, both were profoundly vulnerable to the vagaries of their international patrons. And that brings us to the current moment, which is where I'll close. The American pivot to peacemaking, which I had a front row seat to through the US Institute of Peace, was made with the same strategic incoherence that marked much of the war fighting. You have a government in Washington that is simultaneously supporting and defending a besieged government in Kabul, even as it is negotiating with that government's sworn enemy on that enemy's terms. And once the decision to end the war came, and this became particularly pronounced under President Biden, any of the leverage the US government could have lent the Afghan government, its ostensible partner, it gave away by making very clear that no matter what kind of a peace process did or didn't unfold, the Americans were leaving. And the result of that was that the Afghan security sector was left holding the bag and unable to do so, not because soldiers were unmotivated to take on the Taliban, but because the entire fighting apparatus of the Afghan security sector, from design to operation to maintenance, was really predicated on a reliance on the Americans, American contractors, American air power, American knowledge, and all of that disappeared overnight. And so when the Taliban took city after city, it was not because there was some groundswell of popular support for this insurgency. It was because the American defection triggered a series of elite defections based on a rational calculation that the Afghan government could not survive an American departure. And that tragic self-fulfilling prophecy reflects the notion, that I started my comments with, which is the idea that the survival and therefore the collapse of a post-2001 government were always contingent on the decisions of outsiders, even as those outsiders claimed to be building an Afghan state. And so now the Taliban finds itself as the ruling regime. And so the question becomes, how will it translate this remarkable success as an insurgency and limited success as a rebel government into being the government for the Afghan people? The advantage for the Taliban as an insurgency was that it had this very elegant, if draconian, ideology, very small number of concepts requiring very little in the way of an expansive bureaucracy to make itself manifest. But it ruled more than 20 years ago, and it ruled as a rebel movement only in certain parts of the country. And the country is very different now, demographically, socially, politically. So this totalitarian mission to reproduce a utopia along the lines of this particular vision of Islam It's an ideological pursuit with a very limited indigenous base, and its reliance on Pakistan, its linkages to foreign jihadi networks, for a lot of Afghans reads like foreign occupation. And the cabinet that it's produced reflects nothing of the country's diversity. And even if the democracy was profoundly flawed of the last 2 decades, citizens did grow accustomed to forms of representative and content abilities to access public goods, to access political power that the Taliban has foreclosed overnight. And it's a very open question, I think. How will the Taliban manage the needs and expectations of a plural public that has already shown signs of resistance? How much can it impose by fear? And then at what point is it pushed into different kinds of engagement, or will it collapse? I think the other question, and the last question for me, is how the United States and its allies will now engage Afghanistan. A US government official recently told a news outlet, quote, "As long as the Taliban are in power, they are a sworn enemy of ISIS-K. It's not as if a deal has been done, it's just an acknowledgement that they are in power. That is the partner you need," unquote. So once again, you hear this impulse to instrumentalize a regime in Afghanistan to foreign ends, with little regard for the irony that exudes, from this statement, not even a few weeks after the Taliban was a sworn enemy of the United States. And that, of course, raises the question, well, then what are the responsibilities of the West to the Afghan people? If we understand state building as a form of military intervention to be a kind of neo-imperial project, then it maybe feels strange to argue that the US and its allies should remain engaged. But for me, deciding to invade a country is very different from exercising responsibility as one exits and ends a war. And toppling a regime in the name of democracy is different from engaging with individual citizens within a country as human beings worthy of respect and support. So to oppose the types of interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq at their inception does not require isolationism. It can instead involve a call to acknowledge the possibilities for respecting forms of sovereignty that create opportunities for genuine partnership rather than exploitative frontiership. And if I come back to Noura Lori's idea of precarity, she and I were in conversation just yesterday at a seminar at Columbia where we were speaking about the relationship between precarious sovereignty and precarious citizenship as it's playing out in Afghanistan. A state that never has the real possibility to control and manage its own affairs produces citizens who experience consequent forms of vulnerability, both at home and abroad. And as Nasema Zeerak has powerfully argued, that means that only those Afghans closest to the United States have a chance of being treated as worthy now of American mercy and acceptance. And I think it's a very important time to consider what it would be like for states and peoples to set down these hierarchies for a moment and consider how international relations and human relations might unfold differently without them. So I will leave it here with great interest to hear from both of you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dipali, for those really thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. And Nasema, I'd like to turn to you now.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this and for having me. It's really hard to follow Dipali, and I think in some ways there's nothing left to say. But I will share my remarks. So I think in the last 2 months since the fall of Afghanistan, the 15th of August, there has been much conversation around, Afghanistan, how did it happen, the fall, and in some ways, in order to make some sense of it, I have followed most of them, if not all. And some of the themes and statements that have appeared over and over again in some of these conversations has been things like, oh, we didn't know Afghanistan, or what are some of the lessons learned, or There are deeper calls for reflection for, Americans' roles and responsibilities vis-a-vis Afghans, the peace and the war. And then there are questions of, how to not let something like this happen again in the future. And so the more that I have been listening and the more I think about some of these points, the more elusive they become. Some of them are not really clear what they mean. And that's what I have been thinking about. And so to unpack, when we say that, or when, in the US, in these conversations, it's echoed that we didn't know Afghanistan, what exactly does it mean that we didn't know Afghanistan? The US was in Afghanistan for over 20 years. There were decisions and policies at the highest levels. There were experts, there were conversations. So what exactly does it mean that we didn't know Afghanistan? Next, we must have known some things about Afghanistan. So what are those things that we did know about Afghanistan, and how did we come to know them? What are the assumptions and the things that we know about Afghanistan? What are the contradictions, the limitations, the inconsistencies? So these two questions are kind of my point of entry in this conversation. And mainly these are the things that I have been thinking about personally myself, and also because I have the advantage in some ways of just being at the start of my program here at Humphrey. And the reason that I'm highlighting these two questions is also, I think, in a way to, if I may invite, those, because we're in a policy school, what does it mean for us to be in a policy school? And if we have to reflect on these two questions, what it would mean for us, what would that reflection look like for us? And so I want to start by reading a quote from Shah Mahmoud Hanifi, who's an Afghan historian. Quote, "There is no country on earth more subject to misrepresentations based on Orientalism than Afghanistan," unquote. This becomes clearer when we see that how stereotypes and misrepresentations have become a form of knowledge about Afghanistan, and not just in ordinary conversations, but in very serious high-level conversations and presidential briefs and policy discussions. Stereotypes and misrepresentations such as graveyard of empire or tribal Afghanistan, unruly or violent Afghans, they appear over and over again. We don't talk in these terms about any other country. We don't describe another country's politics, using stereotypes. In fact, it's frowned upon, and not that we should, but the fact that we do that about Afghanistan, it should tell us something. Why is it that Afghanistan is only understandable through stereotypes? Why is it that we need to use the stereotype that, graveyard of empire or tribal Afghanistan in a, presidential brief? These representation and stereotypes, they come from somewhere, they have histories. And if we can trace their genealogies, they can tell us something about their ideological underpinnings, about their assumptions, about the assumptions that we have about these, about, in this case, about Afghanistan and Afghans. When it comes to Afghanistan, there are a variety of these stereotypes and misrepresentations, and a lot of great scholars have tackled them, have studied them. And here I want to focus on one, a notorious one, the notion of tribal Afghanistan. It's a term that's often used to describe Afghanistan and its politics. In a very unsophisticated manner, it's used to reduce complex societies and regions in a very simple term, tribal Afghanistan. President Biden, after the fall of Afghanistan and the failed evacuations, in order to absolve himself, he said, Afghanistan is a tribal country that has never, ever been united with each other. Here, he attributes the problems of Afghanistan, the fact that the country fell, to its tribal nature. And with that, he's saying that no matter what we did, that would be the destiny of the country. So how did this term become so commonplace to describe Afghanistan over and over again and describe its politics? Naveen Manchanda, who's the author of the book Imagining Afghanistan, she does a wonderful job of tracing the genealogy of this term to the late 1800s, when the British Empire was in British India and for the first time encountered the frontier state that's Afghanistan. The British first contacts to Afghanistan were Scotsmen who reflected their own particular history. The Scottish term of, clan was modified to describe the Pashtun lineage. It was not based on a systematic study. It was based on it was documented in the form of a travel log. And this was based on hearsay evidence and an intuitive understanding of Afghanistan, and mostly anecdotal. And so in other words, Afghanistan was understood and imagined by one single person at a particular point of time over 2 centuries ago. And that in a way has set the parameters of our understanding and our imagination of Afghanistan until today. And so in some ways, when we say that Afghanistan is a tribal country, we are assuming that Afghanistan is a country stuck in time over 2 centuries ago. It's also interesting when we see that, there is so much importance that's given to this term tribal Afghanistan, that, the problem of Afghanistan and the fact that it fell is because it's a tribal country. And so the solution should be engaging with these tribes and engaging with the tribes in Afghanistan. But it's interesting that, even acknowledging that, the notion of tribe or the site of tribe has not been an object of systematic and serious study. We just use it as a shorthand to describe Afghanistan and its politics, and in some ways really invalidate an entire country, that, it's tribal and that's the problem. I also want to focus on the notion of tribal Afghanistan alongside the misrepresentation of Afghan women. Looking at these two together jointly will expose some of the inconsistencies and the contradictions how we think about Afghanistan. On the one hand, we declare that Afghanistan is a tribal country. They come together in their communities. They're always entrenched in their tribal affairs. They can never be united. But when it comes to Afghan women, we contradict that notion entirely. We dismiss the tribal nature of Afghanistan, because when we talk about Afghan women, it is by singling them out, by taking them out of their context, by taking them out of their histories. There is a maddening obsession with the way that we profile single Afghan women. We don't consider their tribes or their communities or their families. We take them on their own as individuals, profile them as victims of misogyny or savagery, or Afghan women who have been liberated, who are free through these liberal means, either by singing Bob Dylan songs or by skateboarding. I think if when we and there's this assumption that if we save one Afghan at a time, all Afghan women are gonna be saved, and that also there's the assumption that all Afghan women are the same, no matter where they are, or what time, and what they do. And the phrase "saving Afghan women," I think there is so much to unpack there, even in in that phrase alone. And one would think that that would expire by now, but in the following week of August 15, this term was mobilized again, both by individuals and by organizations. There were calls that we need to save Afghan women. And I think we need to all ask ourselves, why do we need to construct Afghan women as victims, as fundamentally different? And why are we constructing them in a way that they need to be saved? And why are we singling them out in order to save them? Can we save them as part of their communities, as part of their tribes? And in the way that Afghan women are spoken about, their achievements are disregarded, their agency, if not Western liberal, disregarded. There is so much focus on their physical appearances and the way that they dress. There is an urgency to save Afghan women from the Taliban, but there is no conversation about how there is, social, economical, but political processes and institutions that subjugate them. What about those? What about the militarization of Afghanistan and its impact on Afghan women? Recently, I read a headline, and quote, "When foreign men talk to the Taliban about Afghan women's rights." That's really problematic. And I think and there's so much to talk about there. There's so much to unpack there. But I also want to highlight another representation of Afghan women. Recently, Malala Yousafzai has become kind of the face of Afghan women. And I want to clarify that I think Malala is not necessarily as much, she's not as adored as she is in the US and in the West. At least in places that I pay attention, in some ways, she is considered the Western puppet. And so by, assigning Malala as someone who can speak on behalf of Afghan women, are we making a statement, and are we saying that Afghan women cannot speak on their own behalf? There are so many amazing Afghan women around the world who can speak. It's just a genuine question for me. Why is it that Malala goes to the UN Secretary General and talks on behalf of Afghan women? And I think these are some of the things that I have personally been thinking about. And before I end, I just want to, visit one more point that I think is important and it's worth mentioning. And it is that discourses and representations don't happen in a vacuum. They are productive and they set in motion a series of events. So how do Afghans react and take, and in a way talk back to these kind of representations and to these kind of stories about themselves in the West? It's important. It's true that some Afghan women, inside or outside, they have begun to internalize these categories and these stereotypes. Particularly, again, when it comes to Afghan women have started speaking in the same vocabulary, in the same language, which is very strange because we don't speak in those terms. But Afghan women have kind of embodied this Afghan woman rhetoric that we have created. And then also in the aftermath of the fall of Afghanistan, there were, a lot of people, Afghans everywhere were hurt and frustrated. And some Afghan people were expressing that the country fell and that we are in this endless war because we are corrupt, because we are fundamentally violent people, because it's because of the corruption that the Taliban have taken over the country. And I think, it's true that corruption is a big problem in Afghanistan, but the story is not that simple. There's a lot more complexity and nuances there. And it's problematic when Afghans, internalize that rhetoric. Or I was in another conversation and Afghan mentioned that it was wrong for the US to bring democracy to Afghanistan because Afghanistan is stuck in the 14th century. I think that's also really powerful and dangerous because what would that mean for the future generations of Afghans? Are we really, not prepared for democracy? We're incapable of having democracy. So, I will soon end, but I just want to ask a question. And when it comes to the, conversations around Afghanistan, the peace and the diplomacy and war, the misrepresentations, language, and the power that they represent, they're often dismissed and they're considered irrelevant. And we forget that the representations do ideological work. They have consequences, political consequences, and they elicit interventions. They justify interventions, as we have seen they have in Afghanistan. And they have consequences. And in the case of Afghanistan, it has consequences for an entire nation. So I'm in the context of studying gender dynamics and consequences of war on women, Cynthia Enlow encourages us to look at sites that are usually considered as feminine or apolitical to understand the dynamics of war on women or to understand their agency, their struggles. For example, beauty parlor in Iraq is one example that she uses. So for those of us who are in the conversations of policy and politics, how can we expand our purview? How can we look sites that are considered irrelevant for policy in order to capture these complexities that I have talked about in this speech? That's a question that I think I have continued to think about in the last 2 months, and I don't have an answer for, but I hope we can all think about it. I will stop there and very much looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasema and Dipali, both for your deeply informed and very thoughtful remarks. And I come into this very humbled by the deep knowledge that you bring about Afghanistan and hope to add maybe a little bit about my perspective as someone who was a career diplomat, including for the first 10 years of the war in Afghanistan, and now someone who teaches foreign policy and diplomacy. And Nasema, I really appreciate especially your reference several times, and Dipali, yours also, to the idea, the reality that although we have many guests here who are from outside the Humphrey School, that we are a school of public affairs, that we teach about public policy with the goal of forming and building professionals who will engage in policy, in foreign policy, but also in other areas in which perhaps all too often policymakers operate without deep thought about the people who are the objects of their policy. And that certainly is true in the foreign policy sphere. So in a way, my reflections come almost more as a series of questions that I have reflected on over the years, both while I was in the Foreign Service and since I left, about this war in Afghanistan in particular, but the war also in Iraq and the other military actions that came to dominate so much of our foreign policy, especially since September 11th, 2001. The most difficult questions that face policymakers and scholars and face all of us as US citizens or citizens of the world are things that both Dipali and Nasema brought up. And so I will start with a series of questions of my own. And one to start with is the question of how should the US respond, or how should it have responded when there is an attack like that of September 11th, 2001. I was in Tunisia at the time, and when I went with our ambassador to inform the Tunisian foreign minister that the United States would undertake some kind of military action, he warned, he understood, but that this was not going to be a good or easy thing. And so the idea that that was not part of the conversation is not true. From the very beginning, there was an understanding that the reaction to September 11th would likely be a military action, but I think without the thought about what then. But there's also another question, in addition to how should the United States have responded to an attack, is a similarly thorny question of how should the US or the global community respond when a government, say the Syrian government, attacks and kills its own citizens, including through the use of chemical weapons. Should there be a military response? Does the global community have, as the doctrine states, a responsibility to protect those citizens? And if military action is taken, then what? And in that case, if a military response, either to an attack or to a situation in which people are endangered, is justifiable and maybe even seen as wise, what happens after the attack is made? And I think that is part of what I saw as a deeply flawed policy in Afghanistan and Iraq for a long time. In the case of Afghanistan, as in Iraq, it proved relatively easy after an initial overwhelming military attack to defeat the Taliban, to remove them from government, and then what? You know, to take over the capital, and then the difficult part that Dipali spoke about here, and I've heard her speak about at other times, is that then the policy of revenge for that attack meant that the United States would take the lead in creating a government that it wanted to achieve the ends that it wanted, and to set up what then may have been a doomed project. And finally, in terms of my initial questions, and I have also heard Dipali speak about this, is that if one presumes that this war not maybe in the initial conception, but as it went along, and the creation and support of this government was subject to really serious criticism, then what is there, and is there a responsible way to end the military engagement that had gone on for 20 years, and which many had come to criticize, both Americans and Afghans and other people had come to criticize for its harm to Afghan civilians, and as well as dangers to US troops. There has been considerable criticism of how the US withdrew, and the harm that we know continues even as we speak. Harm to individuals in Afghanistan, harm to the project of a functioning Afghan government, and harm in the way in which that government was set up basically to fail. And I know that, and maybe we can get to this later, I know that Dipali, before the fall, wrote about her thoughts about a more responsible way to disengage. But I think that maybe the flip side of Dipali's comments about this government being set up to do what the United States wanted it to do, in some ways doomed it to fail, but it also created a conundrum, I think, for US policymakers who may have seen what was wrong in that approach, but did not know another way to end a bad war. And I'm going to speak just a few more minutes, but speaking more broadly about US policy and moving maybe away a bit from Afghanistan, in the wake of 9/11, there was almost universal support in the US for a military response, for something, to do something, attack somebody, to get revenge, to punish, to stop the terrorists. But it's not clear to me, and it wasn't clear to me then as a Foreign Service officer, that there was a clear plan for what would happen once the attack was undertaken, nor that there were clear goals for a US policy outcome in Afghanistan, and similarly in Iraq. And there were similarly within US policy establishment, people who warned that that was the case, that it was easy to go in and overturn a government, but then what? What happened afterwards? And I think that is the question that goes back to that question of what happens if you decide a military response is needed. From my perspective, as the mission in Afghanistan grew into a massive assistance program alongside the military engagement, the US and other countries who provided that assistance did provide a space, as Dipali and Nasema both talked about, in which many Afghans were able to do the work of building a society that they wanted, one that sought to create a better life for Afghans, to create a space, for example, in which women could be educated and participate in public life, in which institutions could be built. But I find also still that sort of dichotomy or that tension between those things being created as a function of a war which also included drone strikes and vast amounts of money being spent on those military functions that could well have been spent in other places. But the war in Afghanistan and then the added war in Iraq, not to mention the drone warfare campaigns that took place in other countries and military operations in places like Niger and Somalia and other places, in addition to the immediate targets of those operations, I think also warped and distorted our overall foreign policy and our diplomacy. For example, as part of that war, of those wars, countries like Romania and Poland, which had themselves just built their own new democracies and were striving to build a deep relationship with the United States, agreed to have on their territories the Black sites where captives from those wars were tortured before being transferred to Guantanamo. Those requests, which people say in Poland learned about from the Washington Post, impacted the view in those countries of the United States and had either direct or indirect reverberations to the United States image as a country that demonstrated respect for human rights and democracy. It also had a direct impact on simply the ability to conduct diplomacy when so many people were being required to circulate through gigantic embassies that were basically fortresses in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And very often, while there were many people within the Foreign Service who did have knowledge and understanding of the countries in which they served, the vast majority of people who went to those countries to punch their ticket for 10 months or a year barely were allowed to leave the embassy. Even if they wanted to, had little opportunity to engage or to really learn about the country in which they were serving, and where their service rarely extended beyond the confines of the embassies. It similarly warped, distribution of assistance programs from more broad-based and more carefully thought out programs to the programs that supported the projects in Afghanistan or Iraq that were related to those wars. And so I think that there is the other side of the harm that is done, which is that I think that there were many countries and many people in other countries who for a long time questioned and at times were shocked by things that the United States did in response to what was a shocking attack, on the United States that led many to say, well, we have to do something. And I think one thing that I think is not that goes to the broad political decision-making process, and that includes Congress and voters and what appeals to voters, is how the United States thinks about its role in the world and how we shift from an approach that depends so heavily on having a military response, in which we have military budgets and a size of a military that dwarfs by all any standard, any assistance or Peace Corps or Foreign Service approaches to the world. As many like to say, there are more members of U.S. military bands than there are, Foreign Service officers. Certainly the number of people working in development projects trying to support those kinds of things is also dwarfed by the military and by the decisions to increasingly funnel assistance through the military because it's easier to do. And so I think as I wrap up and we get to our questions, I think that the question really is how do we think about Afghanistan, but how do we think also more broadly about our foreign policy and about how the United States, views itself in the world. And just to wrap up where I started, I think it is really important for students who are thinking about careers in public policy, whether that's domestic or foreign or both, to think about, the institutions with which we engage and the people whom we seek to serve, and how how we sort of square those circles of understanding that at times there are dangers in the world and there are bad things and bad actors. How do we respond to those bad actors without allowing our response to them to overwhelm our other approaches to the world? So I'm going to finish up there, and I think I don't know whether Dipali or Nasema, you want to make any additional remarks before we go to questions?
Well, Mary, you asked so many provocative questions. Raised a lot of thoughts for me, but I'm happy to weave that into my answers to the questions that are from the audience.
Great. So we already have a lot of really good questions. I'm going to start with a question from Jane Willard, who says that prior to our invasion, and I'd like to go to this one because of this question about expertise. Prior to the invasion in 2001, the US, and Jane is saying this as someone who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Helmand in the 1970s. And as she says, prior to 2001, the United States had been in Afghanistan in the form not only of the State Department, but also USAID and the Peace Corps, at least back to the 1960s. So how can we say that we didn't know anything about Afghanistan? And I can either Dipali or Nasema.
Nasema, I think you should start on this one.
I mean, that's a really good question. And that's also where I started my remarks, that in the last 2 months, where, there has been so many conversations around what can we learn from this? How can we not let something like this happen again in the future? And I've seen this sentence emerging over and over again, that we didn't know Afghanistan. I don't know. I think in a lot of ways, it is true that we didn't know Afghanistan in the way that we need to know. If we have been engaged with the country for over 20 years, then that shouldn't come now at this point. But I think that also kind of exemplifies the way that Afghanistan is imagined or thought about in the US. It's very inconsistent in my view. It's very, contradictory. And the way that the knowledge about Afghanistan is, I think, I think to me that shows the inconsistency. What does it mean that we didn't know Afghanistan? And then I went into the conversation that, some of the things that have appeared over and over again is that it's misinformation, misrepresentation, the kind of knowledge that, I don't know what else I can add to that.
I mean, it's interesting. I had this experience when I defended my Ph.D. dissertation now 11 years ago, that one of my mentors was inside the State Department at the time in a very high level position. And he said to me, it would be really great to have you come to State and talk about the findings from your research, but I'm actually not sure what we will be able to do with it, And I think this is in general a really profound question, the relationship between the production of knowledge and the creation of policy. And it kind of takes me to, I think let's give the benefit of doubt to the US government that, yes, they had been there in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but they let the country go after the Soviets withdrew. So that kind of expertise was less there. And, the Taliban regime fell so quickly, and maybe there was a kind of optimism that animated the policy that followed. I've just finished a book, as Mary said, on US engagement with the Syrian opposition. This has been for me one of the most dispiriting lessons from that project, which is that the opposition arose in Syria a decade after 9/11. The war in Iraq had been going on for 8 years at that point. There had been plenty of understanding that we must know the Middle East, we must learn about Islam, we must understand. And an uprising emerged organically that was initially nonviolent, that was repressively put down by the Assad regime. And the modes of intervention were far more limited, far less ambitious than they were in Afghanistan or Iraq. It was about supporting people who were rising up on their own terms and taking enormous risks against an authoritarian ruler. And yet, the Western governments that engaged the opposition continually imposed their own ideas of what politics should look like, of what governance should be, of what is legitimate, of what is illegitimate, of what is moderate, of what is extremist, in terms that distorted the politics of the opposition, that involved a lot of false promises that were explicit in some cases, like the red line, that were implicit in other cases, that led me to really come to the conclusion that I think, to Mary's like very difficult questions of how should the US respond, I think for me the default position is not through the use of force, not through the provision of weapons, not through the infusion of massive amounts of aid, and to rather step back and think about, as you were saying, Mary, what is going on that's not about the military, that has been going on for a very long time? And I'll just end by saying I was a senior in college. It was my first week of my senior year of college, the week of the 9/11 attack. And we had a big assembly, and there were, a lot of the big professors and fancy people on campus at Yale held this conversation and wanted to talk to us about how to process what was happening. And I asked a question during this assembly, which I remember because the answer was really dispiriting at the time, which was, after this attack, do you, those in the know, believe that the US relationships with Saudi Arabia and with Pakistan will fundamentally change as a result of this attack? That the dysfunctionality of those relationships has been revealed to be deeply problematic in ways that produced, in many ways, that allowed for an attack on the homeland. And, we can see today that whatever those professors said to me at the time, they haven't fundamentally changed. And that for me is what is really, this is not about trillions of dollars in counterinsurgency money or the effort to remake other societies in our image, all of these things that we could recognize as being problematic and difficult. And this is about bilateral diplomatic relationships. It's about aid policies. It's about thinking again about countries as sovereign in certain ways, as holding them responsible in our relationships with them. But there seems to be an inability to create a surrounding context within which then strategic surgical interventions could actually work. And Mary, you're much better equipped than I am to understand why that is the case, but it continues to be the case. And I think it's an enormous challenge, and it makes me feel that all the knowledge in the world, I don't know what it could do to shift, how to change the incentives within the policymaking system so that those deep sort of pathologies could be unsettled. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, so I think that that those are really difficult questions, and I think there are many answers, but I'm going to throw one factor in here that I think also is really important, and that is that an issue that many people have looked at and studied, which is Congress. And when you take the policy community that has differing levels of knowledge about a particular country, like Afghanistan, and those can be flawed or deep, and then you have a Congress which never questions. One person voted against the authorization for use of military force in September of 2011, and Congress has never voted to end that. Congress votes year after year after year to increase military spending exponentially, and yet struggles to even pass a regular budget for the rest of the foreign affairs functions, including state operations, USAID operations, and all assistance funding. And so it becomes increasingly easy to move things over into the military budget, because that way it will get passed easily. And then that becomes, it becomes a political football in the United States if someone votes against military spending. It rarely becomes a football, except outside of very small communities, if members of Congress try to increase foreign affairs spending. Most Americans think, for example, that foreign affairs spending is 25% of the budget, and it's 1%. So I think that the role of Congress, I think there's many reasons for some of these problems. I think one deep reason is the role of Congress and the political way in which supporting the military in that vague sense, without questioning this sort of scandalously large budget, which then every problem seems to be solvable through the military. I mean, I think there's many other issues there that maybe we can talk about another time, but I do want to I'd like to go back, and I do think that both Dipali and Nasema, to a certain extent, or to a great extent, answered the question from Tianyu Gao at the beginning, or because he does raise the question about the domestic support for the government in Afghanistan, and whether or not you think that the rapid collapse of the Afghan government was due to corruption, or the people's support for the Taliban. Was there support for the Taliban? So maybe this could even be, aside from the sort of problematic aspects, Dipali, that you talked about, what about those issues of support within Afghanistan among Afghan people, either for their government or for the Taliban?
Oh, I was waiting on Nasema. You go ahead, Nasema, I'll come in then.
I actually missed for a moment. So the question was about whether there is support within Afghanistan for the Taliban.
So the question was focused largely on, looking at the rapid collapse of the government, and the question of sort of lack of support for the previous government and or support for the Taliban. So maybe moving away a little bit from US focus to, was the rapid collapse due to lack of support because of corruption or other things, and or was there support for the Taliban?
I think yes and no, and I would really rely on Dipali's answer on this, but I will give a brief answer to that. And I think my question is yes and no. People were not very happy with Ghani at all, and Dipali rightly mentioned that his government in the last couple of years had turned into a three-party government and a private thing. So people were not happy with the way he managed the country, the way he managed the politics, basically. But at the same time, I think, especially when it comes to the issue of corruption and the issue of support for the Taliban, I think those are true, but that's a very narrow way of looking at the issue. If it's possible at all to visit, how was corruption, built into the state of Afghanistan? I think there are so many people who have written and who have reflected on this, that in a lot of ways, corruption was the creation of the US. A lot of Afghan people, a lot of aid people, international experts who were in Afghanistan, they had pointed that there is large scales of corruption in the institutions of Afghanistan, in the capital, in the provincial, the way contracts were passed left and right, the way aid was managed, and there was some knowledge about this, there was conversation about it, but those people who raised this issue were in the minority, because it was easy for a lot of people, for the West and for donor organizations and donor countries, to keep funneling in the money. And the same way for the support of the Taliban, I think it's a really hard question for me personally to answer this question. I mean, the last time when the Taliban were ruling, 1996 to 2001, I mean, there are so many issues that we can talk about. I don't know, it's a reality that there is a very marginal, unlimited support for the Taliban inside Afghanistan. But I think we have to complicate that a little bit. Why is there support for Taliban in Afghanistan? Who would want to live under a Taliban regime where women are not considered human beings, where they don't have their basic rights? Why would these people support the Taliban when, you know, they're implementing their very brutal form of Sharia law? And so people are desperate in Afghanistan in a lot of ways, and so there is a limited support for the Taliban, but it should not be as simple as saying that, oh yeah, people in Afghanistan are happy with the Taliban. It's because people in the last 20 years were sick of the drone strikes. They were sick of the civilian casualty, of the collateral damage, of the poverty, of war, of having every single family losing a family member, of this endless conversation of democracy and election and peace and war all at the same time. I think, and you know, the same way that the US was trying to, you know, win hearts and minds, the Taliban had their own strategy of winning hearts and minds. There was a parallel government in the remote parts of Afghanistan where they were supporting, you know, paying for members to be recruited into the Taliban. And there were families who didn't have food, who needed money. And so, of course, they joined the Taliban. Of course, they would support the Taliban. But I think if we can, you know, imagine that if there's a form of government that looks like the Taliban, if that seems unimaginable to us, then we should just stick to that and not make it as simple that there are people in Afghanistan who support, and question and think why there are people in Afghanistan who would support that. I think, yeah, I will stop there, and I would give Dipali a chance to answer.
I don't have anything to add. I think that's a very good answer.
So I'm going to, before I go to the next question, I'm going to just throw out there also, I think that for those of us here who are Americans, I think it's really important to think about the question of corruption and in the reality that corruption is, it requires money, the money that corrupts, as well as the people who receive it. And in my class this week in foreign policy, we read a news item from a couple of years ago about how weapons were provided to the Syrian opposition, which was the purchase of weapons on the black market that then flooded into Jordan. And then the Jordanian police, so the Jordanian police then became, you know, sold some of those weapons. And so the question was, you know, where was the corruption in that? You know, was it just the Jordanian police who sold the weapons? And the answer to me is no, it's also, you know, the method in which you can say we should support the Syrian opposition, but the mechanism through which that was done in many ways was actually creating corruption. And I think that that's a really, really important thing to remember in a lot of these cases. Nasema, there is one question that is for you specifically from a student who says that he's an undergraduate here at the University of Minnesota, and was curious if you could talk a little more about your reference to Malala and why would Afghan people see her as a Western puppet? Is that because of culture or religion? Could you just talk just a little bit more about that? Because I think on the media here, we do see her as held up as this spokesperson. And so could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes, it's a difficult question, I think, but I appreciate that it was posed. I think for a long time, I've been in the US for a while now, and for a long time, people would ask me certain questions and tell me certain things, and I always felt this discomfort, but I couldn't understand what it was. And so in the recent times, some ways, this is probably a very, not an intellectually sound way of looking at an issue, but in some ways to make sense of some issues for me and to understand where my discomfort comes from, I think about, would we talk or would we say or would we act in the way that we're doing with any other country, with any other people, when we do that about Afghanistan? Would we, for example, choose one American woman and kind of, say that if we solve the problems of this one American woman, we would solve the problems of all American women? Or I think worse than that, if we choose a Canadian woman and say that, if we listen to her, if we, liberate her, if we give her all her rights, then American women will be liberated. Again, I understand this is not the soundest way of looking at an issue, but it really has been an attempt for myself to understand where my discomfort comes from with the way that Afghan people, Afghanistan, its war and its peace is represented in the West. And so when it comes to Malala, I think she's a great, intelligent person. But I think the discomfort is that the way that the women out there in South Asia, in places like Pakistan, in places like Afghanistan, she's reduced to this one, the women are reduced to this one face. And I think that's really problematic. First of all, I mean, I have lived in Pakistan and I have lived in Afghanistan. And these are, from here, we have, from this vantage point, it looks like, those countries, that those people, those women, but dramatically different. And so it's really problematic when we choose another woman from another country and make her the face of Afghan women, particularly after the 20 years of experiment that we had, and particularly at a point like this. I think, and this is something that I expressed, in Pakistan as well. A lot of people in Pakistan are not happy with the way Malala is represented in the West, and that, and she's also a little bit selective in her advocacy. But my point skipped me. But anyways, I hope that answer was satisfactory.
Thank you. And I'm just going to say real quickly here, we have room for more questions if people would like to ask them. But I think, and I suspect this is also part of it, is that Malala is not from Afghanistan. And, maybe just to make that really clear, that may be obvious, but maybe it needs stating that in addition to, how one person sort of is embraced in the West as a symbol of many things, I can imagine it's compounded by the fact that she is not from Afghanistan. And as you said, there are many women from Afghanistan who probably hold many different points of view, rather than having one person sort of held up as that spokesperson. I have a question that I'm not sure I fully understand, but I think goes to sort of the strength of the military, both the military strength of the Taliban versus the any potential strength that the government of Afghanistan or its security forces could have had. I saw this with reference once to Vietnam, and the criticism of the South Vietnamese army and the U.S. decisions there. And the respondent said, yeah, well, what about the strength of the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong, that you need to give them credit also for having done what they did, even if you don't like them. And so maybe this question kind of gets to that. Was it the lack of strength of the inability of the Afghan military because of the design? What about the strength from the Taliban? And maybe even where did that come from?
I mean, I'll take a crack at this. It's a good question. I think there are a couple of things. One, the Taliban is one of the most exceptionally successful insurgencies in modern history. And it will be, I think, a case that students of political violence will study for many, many decades to come. The ability to maintain a coherence as an organization, the ability to sustain multiple leadership transitions, the ability to last for 20 years. And of course, the ability to force the world's most powerful military into a posture of surrender. These are quite extraordinary achievements. The social science literature tells us that one of the variables that gives us a good indicator of whether an insurgency will last is whether or not it has sanctuary. So it is fundamentally impossible to understand the success of the Taliban without recognizing that it had continual safe haven, not just safe haven, but extensive support from the Pakistani security establishment from the beginning, from its conception in the 1990s onward. And that basically meant that at moments when soldiers need reprieve, when they need to be replenished, when they need to be resupplied, rearmed, etc., re-inspired, there was a space over the border where the US military could not, and the Afghan military could not go to fight them, where they could regroup. The entire leadership of the Taliban was called the Quetta Shura, and much like Malala, who is Pakistani, not Afghan, Quetta is a city in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. That was where the leadership of the Taliban resided. It wasn't a secret, it was understood. So this is a very fundamental part of the Taliban's success, but also the challenges that I think it now faces as a government, that it is the hashtag foreign occupation or end the occupation has been trending in Afghan social media. There's a perception of this as a group that, of course, is rank and file, has a very substantial number of Afghans, and many of the leaders are Afghans, but many of those leaders were in exile for decades. And fundamentally, the decision-making within the Taliban cannot be separated from the leadership from the Pakistani ISI, the security wing of the military establishment there. Having said that, as I said, I think there are remarkable features to the resilience of the movement. But the other piece of that is, of course, the incredible weakness of the Afghan government, some of which I've talked about. That, to me, is actually not about a strong enough military as the question. The military was actually very substantial and very well equipped. Part of it had to do with the dependencies on the US that I described. Like if you as a soldier commander don't have the ability to control your GPS because it's controlled, or you have not been allowed to learn how to put munitions onto a plane, it doesn't really matter how big and fancy your equipment is, like you're not able to fight. And this was true about fuel and food and all these other things. Everything about the way the security sector was designed was to be dependent on the US. But I think more importantly than that, and this comes to the question about the popularity or lack thereof of the government, the Taliban did not take over Afghanistan ultimately by fighting battles. City after city was surrendered to them without a fight. And that, for me, was about the kind of political strategy that the Ghani government, the politics of a very, very narrow, centralized to the point of authoritarian approach to rule, that was ethno-chauvinist in nature and was literally privileged certain parts of the Afghan population, of the elite, of the country at the expense of others. And the loss in particular of the northern parts of the country, which are in no way the stronghold of the Taliban, was a reflection of, in my opinion, but also in the opinion of many people who were there at the time, basically a surrendering of those territories, those populations on the part of the government. And at that point, you cannot expect any soldier or commander to rationally fight, even though a number of them did. A number of them did. And, I think in the coming years, there will be some very interesting research done from within the Afghan security forces, stories of what their experience was actually like. But I think, again, for the Taliban, I don't think it was about how strong the Taliban was so much as the real brilliance on their part of recognizing and exploiting the weaknesses of this government and leveraging the fact that they had sanctuary, but also that they understood that the US government was done. And once that happened, then it's just a question of giving a slight shove and all of the dominoes will fall rather than needing to, wage war through the countryside, which is not in fact actually what they did or what they had to do.
Thank you. Nasema, do you have anything to add to that?
Just very briefly, that when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, they were surprised. Their leader came out in the news and said that, yeah, this is, we weren't expecting, we were expecting that we might need to fight, even if a little bit. But and that shows that how, in a way, Afghanistan was handed to them.
So I see that there is another question about minerals, and we only have 2 minutes left. I don't know if either of you have any knowledge about, maybe I can just sort of, use this to wrap up that, I think one of the problems of a war like this and the way that, the government was supported is that there are, as the questioner asks or comments, a lot of valuable minerals can be mined in Afghanistan. And very frequently from the very beginning of this, or even going back to when the Taliban originally took over Afghanistan in the 1990s, there was immediately speculation about oil and pipelines and minerals. And none of that discussion was focused on whether or not those resources would benefit the Taliban people, the Afghan people. And I think that is maybe to wrap up here, that is one of the problems that, some countries like Afghanistan that have endured invasion and occupation by several different countries is that discussions about those things like their resources often focus on who's going to get a hold of them rather than how they're going to benefit the people that are there. So I think that we will wrap up here. I feel like we could go on for hours, and this will not be the last time that we talk about Afghanistan. As I said, we're really fortunate to have both faculty member like Dipali and PhD student like Nasema here at the Humphrey School with us, and to have all of you that joined us today, whether you're at the Humphrey School or not. We hope to continue these kinds of conversations and to do them increasingly, we hope, in person. As a policy school, it's important for us to have these kind of sometimes difficult conversations about policy and about how we think about policy, and how scholars intersect with those policy decisions, as came up a couple times here today. So Dipali and Nasema, thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank Emily Opara, who set up and helped support this project throughout. We're really fortunate to have her here with us today too. So thank you all for attending. And we hope to see you again at another event.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Nasema. Thanks, Emily. And bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.